The sound of my daughter's wine glass shattering against the hardwood floor is what I'll hear for the rest of my life whenever someone mentions Thanksgiving, not the crack of it hitting the ground. The reason it fell, the way her hand went limp when my son-in-law grabbed her wrist across the dinner table and twisted, hard enough that she gasped and everyone at the table went silent, and then he leaned close to her ear in front of my wife, my sister, her husband, and said in a voice he clearly didn't think was loud enough for me to hear, "Say one more word tonight, and I promise you'll regret it." I heard every syllable. My daughter looked at her lap. My wife looked at me, and my son-in-law sat back in his chair, picked up his fork, and resumed eating as if he had simply passed the bread rolls. I'm Gerald Whitmore. I'm 64 years old. For 32 years, I was a federal prosecutor in the Middle District of Tennessee. I have stood in courtrooms and sent men to prison for crimes that would make most people physically ill. I've dealt with drug traffickers, human smugglers, public officials who sold their offices for pocket change. I thought I had developed the ability to read a room without emotion, to observe and calculate before I acted. My wife Patricia always said I was the most patient man she'd ever known, and she didn't always mean it as a compliment. But there is something that happens inside a father when he watches his daughter flinch, and I realized in that moment, watching my son-in-law resume his dinner, that the patience my wife admired had limits I had never found before. I set down my fork very carefully. I pressed my napkin to my lips, and I reached into my jacket pocket and typed one text message to a number I had not used in over a decade. "Need you. Thanksgiving. Bring everything." His response came back in 40 seconds. "On my way. My name is Gerald Whitmore, and this is the story of what happened after dessert. Let me go back to the beginning, because the beginning matters. My daughter Claire is my only child. She is 32 years old, and she has her mother's eyes and her grandmother's stubbornness and the kind of laugh that has always made rooms brighter. She married my son-in-law 3 years ago, and I will tell you plainly that I stood at that altar with a smile on my face and a quiet unease in my chest that I told myself was nothing more than a father's unwillingness to let go. I was wrong about what it was. He came across as polished. That was the word Patricia always used. He had a firm handshake and a good vocabulary and a way of looking directly at whoever was speaking to him that made people feel heard and important. He ran a medical billing and consulting company out of Nashville called Velocity Health Partners. The premise was straightforward. He told me over dinner when they were first dating. Hospitals and physician groups generated enormous amounts of billing paperwork, and most of them were leaving significant money on the table by not coding their procedures correctly. His company reviewed their billing processes, identified gaps, and recovered revenue they were owed. He had 22 employees. He drove a car that cost more than my first house. I told myself the unease was about the money, that I was simply uncomfortable with how quickly he'd accumulated it. I told myself that for 3 years. Over those 3 years, I noticed things I chose to explain away. My daughter stopped calling as often. When I saw her in person, she seemed to choose her words more carefully than she used to, like someone who had learned that certain observations had costs. Once she came to Sunday dinner with a bruise on her forearm that she said was from bumping into a cabinet door. Once she arrived 40 minutes late with eyes that were slightly red at the corners and told us she'd had allergies all week. I am a man who spent 3 decades presenting evidence to juries. I know what it looks like when someone has been crying, but I accepted the explanations. Patricia accepted them. We wanted to believe our daughter was happy. That is the part that has been hardest to forgive in myself. Thanksgiving was at our house this year. Patricia had been cooking for 2 days. My sister and her husband drove up from Chattanooga. Claire and my son-in-law arrived an hour late, which I noted but didn't mention, and my daughter hugged me at the door in a way that lasted 2 or 3 seconds longer than usual. We sat down to dinner around 6. The conversation was fine at first. Normal holiday conversation, football and family updates, and whether the bread stuffing or the cornbread dressing was superior, which is a debate in our family that will apparently never be resolved. My son-in-law was charming. He asked my brother-in-law about his contracting business, with what seemed like genuine interest. He complimented Patricia's cooking twice. The moment came around the time I started carving the second turkey breast. My daughter made a comment. That's all it was. A comment about how the Nashville office market had been softening, and wondering aloud whether it made sense for him to renew the lease on their current space rather than looking at something smaller. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't an argument. It was the kind of thing spouses discuss at dinner tables all across this country every single day. He reached across the table. He took her wrist, and that glass hit the floor. For the next hour and a half, I sat at that table, and I was two people simultaneously. I was the father who wanted to stand up and put himself between his daughter and this man permanently. And I was the prosecutor, the observer, the one who had learned long ago that the most effective response is rarely the most immediate one. I kept the table conversation moving. I watched. I waited. I saw the way he watched her refill her water glass. I saw the small adjustment she made to how she was sitting, the almost imperceptible pulling inward, the way a person makes themselves smaller to avoid occupying space someone else might claim. I had seen that posture before. I had seen it in interviews with domestic violence victims I had helped prosecute cases for over the years. After dinner, while Patricia and my sister were clearing dishes, I found a reason to step outside onto the back porch. I stood in the cold November air, and I looked at that one text message I had sent. The man I sent it to was named Harlan Briggs. We had worked together on a case in 2011, a complex wire fraud investigation involving a contractor who had been systematically overbilling the federal government for infrastructure work. Harlan had been the lead investigator on that case, a former IRS criminal investigation agent who had spent 27 years following money through shell companies and offshore accounts and falsified invoices. He had the patience of a geologist and the memory of a man who had never once been surprised to learn that someone was not what they claimed to be. When he retired, he opened a private practice doing exactly what he'd always done, following money and finding out where it went. I had called him once, 2 years earlier, for a different reason, a reason I will come back to. He arrived at my house at 9:15, which meant he had driven the 60 miles from Murfreesboro in just over an hour. He knocked on the back door rather than the front. I let him in, and we stood in the kitchen while the rest of the family watched football in the other room. "Talk," he said. He was never a man who wasted words. I told him what I had seen. The wrist, the words, the bruise I had noticed 6 months ago, the changes in my daughter over 3 years. He nodded. "What else?" "His business," I said. "Medical billing consulting, 22 employees. Revenue that doesn't seem calibrated to the size of the operation." Harlan was quiet for a moment. "How long has the company been operating?" 4 years. "What kind of clients?" "Physician groups, smaller regional hospitals, surgical centers." He looked at me in a way I recognized from courtrooms. The look of a man who had just heard something click into place. "You're a federal prosecutor," he said. "Retired. You know what I'm thinking." "Tell me anyway." "Upcoding," he said. "Billing for procedures at a higher complexity level than what was actually performed. Or unbundling. Billing separately for components of a procedure that are supposed to be billed together. Or straight fabrication, billing Medicare and Medicaid for services that were never provided. Or all three." "Or all three," he agreed. "What made you call me, Gerald? The wrist or the business?" "Both," I said. "But here's the thing, Harlan. When Claire mentioned the lease, when she raised the question of whether the office space made financial sense, he reacted the way a man reacts when someone wanders too close to something they're not supposed to know about. It wasn't anger about her questioning his judgment. It was something more specific than that." Harlan set his coffee cup down. "All right. Let me start tonight." I told him I needed to speak with my daughter first. I found Claire in the hallway upstairs, where she had gone to get a sweater. She looked at me when I came up the stairs, and there was something in her expression that I can only describe as bracing, like she was preparing for a conversation she had been dreading and had known was coming. "Dad, I'm fine," she said before I could speak. "You're not," I said. "And I'm not asking you to tell me you are." She looked at the carpet. "It's not as bad as it looked." "How long?" She didn't answer immediately. In the silence, I could hear the television from downstairs, a crowd cheering for something. "The first time," she said finally. was about 8 months after we got married. I kept my face still. I had learned to keep my face still. What happened? He didn't like something I said at a work event, a comment I made to one of his clients that he thought was inappropriate. She paused. He apologized for 2 weeks afterward. He said it would never happen again. He said he'd been under an enormous amount of pressure and that he wasn't himself. And after the second time, she looked at me then, and her eyes were very steady and very sad. How did you know there was a second time? Because there always is. She sat down on the top step. I sat beside her. She told me about the second time, and the third, and the pattern that had developed, the way the incidents were always preceded by stress about the business, the way he was more volatile in the week before a major client renewal or a quarterly filing period. She told me about his business partner, his college roommate who co-owned Velocity Health Partners with him, a man named Ray Cutler who had been at their wedding and who my son-in-law talked about with the combination of affection and wariness that told you everything about the nature of that partnership. Then she told me something she said she had never told anyone. About a year ago, she said quietly, I found a file on his laptop. He left it open. I wasn't snooping. I just walked past and the screen was there. What was in it? I didn't understand most of it. It was billing codes, hundreds of them, in a spreadsheet, with 2 columns. One column was labeled actual, and one was labeled submitted. The numbers in the submitted column were consistently higher. She paused. I asked him what it was. He closed the laptop and told me it was a comparison analysis he ran for clients, showing them the gap between what they billed and what the market rate was. He said it was proprietary methodology, and I wouldn't understand it even if he explained it. Did you believe him? A long pause. No. What made you doubt it? Because when I asked, he wasn't annoyed that I was curious. He was frightened. She looked at her hands. I've learned to read the difference. I put my arm around my daughter's shoulders and I held her the way I used to when she was 7 years old and something had scared her. She let me. After a moment she said, Dad, what are you going to do? What I should have done sooner, I said. But I need you to be willing to answer some questions tonight. Harlan is here. She pulled back and looked at me. You already called him? Hours ago. Something shifted in her face. Not surprise. Something that looked more like relief so profound she had been afraid to let herself feel it until now. We went downstairs. Harlan spent 45 minutes with my daughter at the kitchen table. I sat with them. Patricia kept the rest of the family occupied with a second round of dessert and the understanding that sometimes her husband needed space to handle things in ways she had learned over 3 decades not to interrupt. Claire told Harlan everything she told me, and then more. The billing codes, the late nights before quarterly filings, the way Ray Cutler visited the house twice a month and always arrived with a laptop bag and left without it. The name of a doctor she had heard mentioned repeatedly in hushed phone calls, a doctor, Ellison, who her husband referred to as our guy at Mercy Regional. The fact that 2 of their largest clients were surgical centers in rural counties where the oversight infrastructure was thin and the billing volumes were high enough that anomalies were easy to bury. Harlan took notes in the small spiral notebook he always carried. When Claire finished, he looked at his notes for a moment and then looked up. Miss Claire, he said, and there was a gentleness in his voice that I had heard him use before with reluctant witnesses. What you've described is consistent with a coordinated Medicare fraud scheme. I want to be honest with you about what that means. If your husband and his partner have been doing this at scale, the investigation that follows is going to be significant. There will be federal agents involved. There will be a period of time that is going to be very difficult. But here is what I also need to tell you. What you've just shared with me is the kind of information that investigators have been trying to find a thread on for a long time. Claire looked at him steadily. How do you know they've been looking? Because I called someone while I was driving here, Harlan said. An old contact at the HHS Office of Inspector General. I gave him your husband's company name without giving him any other details and asked if it rang a bell. He called me back before I pulled into your father's driveway. It rang more than a bell, Miss Claire. Velocity Health Partners has been flagged in 3 separate anomaly reviews over the past 2 years. They haven't been able to make a case because everyone close enough to the operation has been either complicit or controlled. My daughter was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, or both. The next hours unfolded with the specific momentum that investigations develop when the right piece falls into place. Harlan made calls. I made calls of my own to a colleague still serving in the prosecutor's office. A woman I had mentored for 11 years and who I trusted absolutely. She was at a family dinner of her own, and she listened to what I told her, and she said, "Give me an hour," and called back in 40 minutes to tell me she had looped in the assistant U.S. attorney who had been running a quiet parallel investigation into medical billing irregularities across the region. My son-in-law, for his part, spent the evening in my living room watching football with my brother-in-law, entirely unaware that the house he was sitting in had become, in the space of a few hours, the place where his life as he knew it would end. He came to find Claire around 11 o'clock. He walked into the kitchen and saw her sitting with me and Harlan, and he stopped in the doorway with an expression that moved through several phases very quickly. Surprise, then calculation, then the particular stillness of a man who is trying to determine how much of a threat he is facing. "Who are you?" he said to Harlan. "An old colleague of your father-in-law's," Harlan said pleasantly. "We're just catching up." He looked at my daughter. "Claire, it's getting late. We should head home." My daughter looked at her hands on the table. Then she looked up at him, and I watched something happen in her face that I can only describe as the final closing of a door. "I'm not going home with you tonight," she said. The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. "Excuse me?" His voice was quiet in a way that wasn't quiet at all. "You heard her," I said. He looked at me then, and I could see him making his assessment. He had always been polite to me, the careful politeness of a man who wanted to maintain access while not particularly respecting the person he was being polite to. He was reassessing now. "Gerald, this is between me and my wife. The moment you put your hand on her at my dinner table," I said, "you made it considerably more than that." "I didn't. I watched you," I said. "So did Patricia. So did my sister." I kept my voice level. 32 years of courtrooms will do that for you. The officers who are going to arrive here in approximately 20 minutes will take statements from all of them. The color changed in his face. "What officers?" He tried to say it with contempt and missed. "The domestic violence unit has a response team that works holidays," I said. "As it turns out, so does the FBI's Financial Crimes Division when the call comes from the right number." He looked at Harlan again, reassessing. "You can call your attorney," I said. "That's your right, and I'd encourage you to exercise it. You can also call Ray Cutler and tell him whatever you'd like. You have time for 1 or 2 calls before things become more complicated." I watched him decide. He reached into his pocket and his eyes moved to Claire with something in them that made my chest tighten, and I stood up from the table. "Look at your wife one more time like that," I said quietly, "and the call I just described will be the least of your concerns." He looked at me instead. "You're bluffing," he said. "I spent 32 years prosecuting people who believed that," I said. He called his attorney. He stepped into the hallway, and I heard him speaking in the low, urgent cadences of a man who has just realized the ground beneath him has shifted. He came back into the kitchen 3 minutes later with his jaw set. "Richard says I don't have to speak to anyone without him present." "Richard is correct," I said. "But the officers aren't coming to talk to you. They're coming to take a statement from my daughter about what happened at this table tonight. You're welcome to sit in my living room and wait." He stood in the doorway for another long moment. Then he went back to the living room. The officers arrived 18 minutes later. They spoke with Claire, photographed the bruising that had developed on her wrist, documented her statement. A detective who looked young enough to be my grandson handled it with a thoroughness that impressed me. My son-in-law, on advice from his attorney, who was now on the phone with him continuously, said nothing and allowed himself to be cooperative, in the technical sense of not actively obstructing. But here is the thing about a man who has been running a fraud operation for several years. He has learned to appear calm in moments of crisis. He has practiced it. What he had not practiced was the specific kind of calm required when the crisis is coming from a direction he didn't anticipate and expanding faster than he can manage. At 12:40 in the morning, Harlan received a call. He listened for 90 seconds, thanked the person on the other end, and sat back down at my kitchen table. "The OIG contact I called earlier," he said. "He's been on the phone with the AUSA. They've been sitting on a wiretap authorization for 6 weeks, waiting for a predicate strong enough to move on. What your daughter described tonight, combined with the parallel case they've already been building, is apparently what they needed." He paused. "They're moving tonight." I looked at him. "How fast?" "They'll have search warrants for the Velocity offices and for Ray Cutler's home by 6 a.m. They want to speak with Claire officially as soon as possible. And they want to know if your son-in-law is willing to cooperate in exchange for charging consideration, because his partner, based on what they've already collected, is significantly more exposed." In the living room, I could hear my son-in-law's voice, still quiet, still controlled, talking to his attorney. "He doesn't know yet that Ray is the one they actually want," I said. Harlan nodded slowly. I went to find Patricia. She was sitting at the top of the stairs, which was where she always sat when she was waiting for something, and she looked at me the way she had looked at me across 38 years of marriage, when there was something serious to discuss. I sat beside her. "How bad is it?" she asked. "The marriage is over," I said. "That part is certain. The rest depends on what he decides to do in the next few hours." "Claire? She's going to be all right," I said. "It's going to take time, but she's going to be all right." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "You knew something was wrong. I should have done something sooner." "You did something tonight," she said. "That text was sent 3 hours too late." She took my hand. "Gerald, you don't get to be responsible for every moment you didn't know. You get to be responsible for the moment you did." In the morning, the investigation became real in the way that investigations become real, which is to say it became visible. The warrants were executed at the Velocity Health Partners offices at 6:20 a.m., while most of the city was still asleep. At the same time, federal agents arrived at Ray Cutler's home in Brentwood with a search warrant and, after a brief conversation at the door, an arrest warrant as well. Ray had, it turned out, made the understandable but catastrophic mistake of attempting to access the company's server remotely at 2 in the morning, which is the kind of thing that does not go unnoticed when there are monitoring orders in place. My son-in-law was arrested on domestic violence charges at my house at 7 a.m. He had fallen asleep in my guest room, which in retrospect was one of the stranger aspects of that night. When the officers came to the door, he was cooperative in the mechanical way of a man who understood that resistance would only add charges and who was already doing the arithmetic of his situation in his head. As they walked him out, he looked over his shoulder at me. "You had no idea what you were getting into," he said. "Neither did you," I told him. In the weeks that followed, the investigation expanded in ways that went beyond what I had anticipated, which is saying something because I had anticipated quite a lot. Velocity Health Partners had been engaged in a systematic fraud against Medicare and Medicaid that investigators ultimately quantified at over $4 million across 37 months. The methodology was exactly what Harlan had described, a combination of upcoding, unbundling, and in a smaller but more serious number of cases, billing for procedures that had never been performed on patients who either didn't exist or had not received the services their records claimed. Dr. Ellison at Mercy Regional, the physician my daughter had heard mentioned in those phone calls, had been signing off on fraudulent procedure codes in exchange for a monthly payment structured to look like a legitimate consulting agreement. 2 other physicians at smaller clinics had similar arrangements. An administrator at one of the rural surgical centers had been complicit in passing claims he knew were false. But the piece that made the case go from significant to serious, the piece that required a second press conference and a joint statement from 3 different federal agencies, was the staged injury component. My son-in-law had developed a network of what the investigators came to call claim seeding. He identified Medicare and Medicaid beneficiaries, often elderly people in lower income areas, and through a series of intermediaries connected to the practice's patient outreach programs, arranged for those beneficiaries to appear in medical records as having received treatments they had never had. The payments went to the practice. The practice paid Velocity. Velocity took its cut and distributed the rest. In 17 documented cases, the fraudulent billing had been attached to the records of real patients who had real conditions, and in several of those cases, the fraudulent entries had created confusion in their medical records that led to duplicated treatments, misdiagnoses, or incorrect medication interactions. An elderly woman in Rutherford County had been treated for a condition she didn't have because her records showed a prior procedure that had never occurred. She had spent 11 days in the hospital before a careful resident caught the discrepancy. When Claire learned about that woman, she requested to meet her. I drove her to Rutherford County on a Tuesday in February. The woman was 81 years old, and she had a daughter about Claire's age. And the four of us sat in a small living room, and the two daughters held hands for a while without saying much. On the drive back, Claire said, "I kept telling myself that whatever he was doing with the business wasn't my problem to fix, that I didn't know enough to know if it was wrong. I told myself that lie for a year." "You knew enough," I said. "You were afraid." "I was afraid," she agreed. "But I also let myself not know things. Does that make sense?" I made a choice not to follow the thread because I was afraid of where it led. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not going to do that again." She didn't. At the trial, which began 8 months after Thanksgiving, my daughter testified for a day and a half. She described the billing document she had seen on his laptop. She described the conversations she had overheard. She described the pattern of abuse and control that had been used to ensure her silence. She was cross-examined by a defense attorney who attempted to suggest that she was a scorned wife using a criminal proceeding as a weapon in a divorce. And she looked at that attorney with the steadiness of someone who has already lost everything she was afraid to lose and found the losing less catastrophic than the fear. "I am getting a divorce," she said. "That's accurate. But I'm also telling the truth. Both things can be true at once, and in this case, they are." Ray Cutler had already pleaded guilty and agreed to cooperate. His testimony corroborated everything Claire and the forensic evidence had established. Dr. Ellison pleaded guilty 4 days before trial. The administrator at the surgical center had cooperated early and received a reduced sentence for it. My son-in-law was convicted on 14 counts, including healthcare fraud, conspiracy, wire fraud, and several related charges. He was sentenced to 22 years in federal prison. At sentencing, the judge noted that the harm done was not only financial, but had compromised the medical records of vulnerable people who deserved to trust that the healthcare system was working in their interest. He said that the use of intimidation and domestic violence to maintain the silence of someone who might have revealed the fraud added a particular dimension of cruelty to the case. Ray Cutler received 16 years. Dr. Ellison received 7. The civil recoveries took another year and a half to resolve. The insurance carriers and government agencies filed suit and, between them, recovered approximately $3 million from the seized assets of the company, the two principals, and their network of related entities. It wasn't everything. It never is. But it was a reckoning. My daughter moved into an apartment a mile from our house in March of the following year. She started running in the mornings, which she had always wanted to do but had somehow never been able to when she was married. She took a week off in April and drove to see friends in Denver. She called me on a Thursday night in May just to talk. Without any particular agenda, the way she used to call before the years of careful words and long sleeves. And when I heard her voice, easy and unguarded, I had to set the phone down for a moment and collect myself. I didn't tell her that. Some things a father keeps to himself. About a year after the Thanksgiving dinner, I was sitting on the back porch in the late afternoon with a cup of coffee when she came over, let herself in the way she had her whole life, and found me there. She sat in the chair beside me. For a while, we watched the last of the November light work across the yard. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "Tell me." I spent a long time being angry at myself for not seeing it earlier, for not leaving sooner. She wrapped both hands around her tea mug. "But I've been in therapy long enough now that I understand something about that." He was very deliberate. The isolation, the control over information, the way he made me doubt my own perceptions. Those aren't accidents. That's architecture. He built a structure around me designed to prevent exactly what eventually happened. What eventually happened being that you told the truth. That I told the truth, she agreed. And you know what I've decided? I'm not going to spend the rest of my life apologizing for the years it took me to get there. I'm going to spend it doing something with the fact that I did get there. She looked at me. I've been talking to a victim advocacy organization in Nashville. They do legal companion work, helping survivors navigate the court process. I'm going to start volunteering with them in January. I looked at my daughter. I thought about the girl who used to bring me coffee she'd made herself at age 9, proud of the accomplishment. The cup always slightly overfull because she didn't want to shortchange me. I thought about the woman I had watched shrink and disappear over 3 years and had not intervened on sooner, which is the failure I will carry without resolution for the rest of my life. I thought about Harlan Briggs driving 60 miles in the dark without asking any questions first. That sounds right, I said. I thought you'd say something more, she said. Something fatherish. What would you like me to say? She thought about it. Nothing, actually. You don't need to say anything. I just like telling you things. She leaned her head briefly against my shoulder, the way she had done when she was small. Thank you, Dad, for making the call. I should have made it sooner. You made it when you knew to make it, she said. That's all any of us can do. We sat as the dark came on. Somewhere in a federal correctional facility, my son-in-law was calculating the distance between where he was and any version of the future he had planned for himself. Somewhere in Nashville, a woman I had never met was seeing a correct entry in her medical records for the first time in 2 years. Somewhere in a small apartment a mile away, my daughter's life was being rebuilt on ground that was hers alone. I am 64 years old. I spent 32 years in courtrooms, and I have seen, with some consistency, the way that evil maintains itself. It maintains itself through silence, through the fear of disruption, through the calculation that the costs of speaking are higher than the costs of staying quiet, through the patient and deliberate work of people who understand that if you can make someone doubt themselves long enough, they may never find their way back to the truth. What I have also seen, with equal consistency, is that the whole structure, the whole carefully constructed architecture of it, can come down from a single thread being pulled. It doesn't take an army. It doesn't always take years. Sometimes it takes one person deciding that tonight is the night, that this moment is the one they will not let pass, that the cost of speaking has finally, definitively dropped below the cost of silence. It takes one person willing to send the text. I am Gerald Whitmore. I am 64 years old, and on the night my son-in-law put his hand on my daughter at my Thanksgiving table, I made a choice. Not a brave choice. I want to be clear about that. I want to be clear because I think the word brave gets attached to things like this in a way that makes them seem exceptional, makes them seem like something only certain people are capable of. It was not brave. It was simply the correct thing to do. And the only variable was whether I would choose to do it, or choose instead the easier thing, which was to say nothing, to preserve the dinner table peace, to tell myself it wasn't as bad as it looked, and trust that things would improve. I had told myself that for too long already. When you see it, you have a choice. You can calculate the disruption and decide it isn't worth it. You can look away and tell yourself you don't know enough to know for certain. You can wait for a better moment that has a way of never arriving. Or you can send the text. I sent the text, and I will keep sending it for as long as my daughter needs someone who will.